as you can see, I'm not the Bishop of London, but he sends his apologies, and I know he would have been here if he could have. I'm sure at times he's had smaller congregations, but maybe we'll get more for Evensong, so bear with us. Interesting, when I arrived just a few minutes ago, the lady who welcomed me said, "Oh, I'm surprised the church is interested in climate change." So I've obviously got a bit of a job to do here, but we are. And just to repeat, I'm David Shreeve. I don't know that I am the advisor to the Bishop of London, because he's got his own views really on these things. I'm the environmental advisor to the Archbishop's Council of the Church of England. Those guys have got their own views as well, but anyway, I have the job of advising the Church of England on environmental issues, which include climate change. And of course, climate change is nothing new to people of various faiths. Many have grown up with stories of flood, earthquake, and famine over many years. And some still believe that the end of the world is foretold by global warming is only the beginning. Well, there is actually considerable interest and environmental concern within most faiths. I have a new book coming out next month, which I've written with a Jew and a Muslim, with the aim of showing members of the three faiths, those of no faith, how a concern for the environment is fundamental to all three Abrahamic faiths. We have been encouraged to produce this book by the chief rabbi, who says, "We may have different heavens, but we all share the same earth." No one would claim that having a concern for the environment is limited to people of faith. And what is more, it would be very wrong to claim that everyone involved with faith sings from the same hymn sheet. Indeed, within the Church of England, you can find views of all shades of green and blue, especially amongst the clergy and indeed the bishops. Whilst the Church of England is the established church, with all that that means, with a structure, there is no one view. And like the question of women bishops, individual clergy and members of congregations will have a variety of views, and sometimes no views. Two recently published books on the subject of climate change shows the widely differing opinions within the church. One from a retired bishop who wrote, "It is time the Christian church woke up to the urgency of climate change." And he wrote his book to provide a theological framework for understanding and responding to the most urgent environmental challenge facing the world today. Whilst at the same time, a priest in Cambridge who has a science degree has written a book because he has been provoked by the current incessant presentation in the media, and sad to say by the churches as well, of an environmental crisis just about to happen. Between these very different views, there are clergy sharing in the news that scientists cannot agree, and we are experiencing the wettest drought for years. Few clergy have the luxury of abandoning their cars in favour of a bicycle to carry out their daily duties, often involving more than one parish, whilst they live in buildings, live and work in buildings, often built long before anyone had ever imagined there would be energy-saving trusts or carbon offsets or even smart meters. For our clergy, environment is just one of many issues, and one which we have to admit does not usually have an immediate impact on day-to-day issues. I well remember sitting down after making a presentation on the environment and the church and hearing a clergyman sitting behind me say to his neighbour, "These greenies have to understand that they've got to get in the queue. I've got the homeless and the hungry, broken families and destitute children to deal with." I didn't, but I wanted to turn around to him and say, yes, and if we get the environment wrong, those problems could get even worse. Over the years, the church's incumbents have often been environmental enthusiasts. Gilbert White, Reverend C.A. Johns, whose Flowers of the Field ran to 28 editions, Andrew Young, bless you, and W. Keble Martin, who spent 60 years working on his concise Flora of Britain. The entry in the Reverend Francis Kilvert's diary for today's date in 1871 shows just how our weather varies. It was very hot this morning, burning hot, as I was in the garden tying up 3 or 4 dozen lettuces. Well, like Robin, I came here on 2 wheels, and I can tell you today outside it is certainly not the day to be tying up your lettuces. You don't get away that lightly, I've got another page. However, despite these enthusiasts, the church has been accused of coming late to develop an environmental concern. The recent path began in 1968, when the Lambeth Conference recorded its major concerns about the growing threats of pollution. 10 years later, the conference addressed an appeal to leaders of governments of the world on environmental issues and said that time was running out. In 1988, the conference passed a resolution calling upon each province and diocese as a matter of urgency to inform the faithful about what is happening to our environment and to encourage them to see stewardship of God's earth for the care of our neighbours as a necessary part of Christian discipleship. In 1998, participants were urged to translate these aspirations into action. In 2005, the Church of England's Mission and Public Affairs Council commissioned a report sharing God's planet, a Christian vision for a sustainable future. And as a result, General Synod passed a resolution endorsing the report and called for a reduction in the Church of England's environmental footprint. As a result, in 2006, Shrinking the Footprint was launched as a national campaign to enable the whole of the Church of England to address in faith, practice and mission the issue of climate change. The first stage, Measuring Our Footprint, was launched on World Environment Day 2006. In 2007, the UK's Environment Agency carried out research amongst a number of environmental and sustainable development experts with the aim of identifying the 50 most important actions for overcoming ecological crisis. At number 2, out of 50, between saving energy and installing solar power, the experts placed the need for world's religions to make the planet their priority. Comments from participants included, "The world's faith groups have been silent for too long on the environment. It is time they fulfilled their rightful collective role in reminding us that we have a duty to restore and maintain the ecological balance of the planet. The Dean of Forestry at Yale recently told a group of religious leaders, "I used to think the top environmental problems facing the world were global warming, environmental degradation, and ecosystem collapse, and that we scientists could fix those problems with enough science. But I was wrong. The real problem is not those three items, but greed, selfishness, and apathy. And for that we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. We need your help." On an international level, the ecumenical patriarch of the Orthodox Church has been billed as the Green Pope after the media announced that the patriarch had declared pollution a sin. Actually, the patriarch went much further, declaring, "For humans to cause species to become extinct and to destroy biological diversity of God's creation, for humans to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, stripping the earth of its natural forests, or destroying its wetlands, for humans to contaminate the earth's waters, its lands, its air, and its life with poisonous substances, these are sins." The Church of England is part of the Anglican Communion worldwide and involves 70 million people in 161 countries. That is a potential worldwide body of environmental concern, far greater than any environmental organisation. So, what are we doing in the Church of England with our 16,200 churches, 10,000 churchyards, 5,000 schools, 3 palaces, plus countless clergy houses and offices? If you add the energy use of its members with all of the buildings, then you come up with the church being a major energy user. This year, we have begun connecting up our churches to an online energy resource which records energy use and the local weather to produce energy advice. Some churches are installing solar panels, but a recent suggestion from one diocese to put up wind turbines has caused a major stir. We are involved in a number of initiatives nationally, regionally, and locally to reduce energy use, protect biodiversity, and encourage sustainable lifestyles. We work with government and national bodies, and we are involved in a community energy scheme, which Ruth, who I think has just arrived, will be telling you about when she talks about her work at the WI. And some of our bishops, at least for the time being, can raise and debate environmental issues in the House of Lords. And we are using YouTube to show clergy and congregations the practical ways to manage church property in an environmentally sustainable way and the theological reasons why. The emblem of Help Rescue the Planet represents the synthesis between religion and environmentalism. The website says people should have faith that the environmental movement is there to protect God's creation. I hope that I've helped you see that the Church, along with other members of faith communities, is aware of its responsibilities and is endeavouring to play its part. had the Bishop of London been able to come here today, he may have spoken about his concern that the environment seems to be currently on the back burner. So rather than sit back and relax, he is saying that now is the time when the church should be taking stock and getting advice as to what the next environmental crisis might be and when, so that the church can use this time to prepare. I'm sure he would have been pleased to see that some of the experts that he is meeting to hear their views were in fact on your programme to speak during this conference. I do have some films, but I think you are running late. And Ruth is here, and you probably want to hear from her too. So, if there are questions, or I can organise a collection.
David, thank you very much indeed. Ruth has arrived, I understand, but I think we're going to ask you, Ruth, if you can speak after lunch, which will give us some time to put some questions to David. I have a rather naughty one, actually.
Right. Well, bear in mind, I'm only a stand-in, and I'm not ordained, so no theology, please.
That's probably just as well with this question. Surely the major issue that the planet faces is overpopulation. So endorsing gay marriage is surely a good solution.
Well, we'll have to ask some friends of mine about that. I don't know.
Does anybody have a question for David, please? Rachel.
Thank you. I'd just like to know whether you thought that the positive messages about God's creation and looking after and being stewards of the planet are more powerful than the ones about, and the negative ones about not polluting. Because I think for me that's a major, well, it's an issue, is whether we should always try and be positive about things, which we tend to be. But actually, some of the things in healthcare, for example, which are very powerful and maybe more simple messages, are about fighting things. So you're fighting cancer. That's, there's a baddie that it's easy to get a grip on. And I wondered if you have experienced that with kind of broad populations within the church.
Yeah. Well, as well as my church job, I do run something called the Conservation Foundation, and that has a sort of a byline of saying that we promote positive news about the environment. So whether I was asked to do this for the church because of my positive outlook on the environment, but I think the doom and gloom people have really killed the interest of an awful lot of people. And I think not long ago, there was a guy on the corner down the road on Oxford Circus with his sign saying, the end of the world is nigh and it's doom and gloom, and the poor guy didn't look very happy, and everybody else around him was getting on with their lives. And I think the great thing that the church can do is not only to get its own house in order and set an example in the community, but actually have a positive outlook. I mean, as I say, Ruth is going to talk about something we're involved with for community energy. Now, one isn't suggesting that the local vicar is an expert in that, but at least he's got a big building in the middle of the community where he can invite people in and discuss whether, in fact, community energy is a possibility. And if so, what sort of community energy could it be? And as I mentioned, there are some people rather upset down in Devon with some plans for wind farms. Maybe there is a better way, maybe the River Dart or something could be used to bring the power. But I think, the church, it's interesting, surprised that the church was interested in climate change. And the one thing the church can say is that as far as environmental concern, it is not jumping on the bandwagon. The very first verses of Genesis talk just about that God created the world and we ought to be looking after it. So I think that it seems to me a bit of a no-brainer. And if you're going to be responsible for something and just do the doom and gloom, I mean, we've lost the future generation, I would have thought. We've got to say, isn't the world a wonderful place? And even though the weather's not so nice today as it was in Kilford's 1871, May the 7th, it is still an amazing place. And there's a new film that's coming out in September called Samsara, which looks at the world, and it's not for television, it's for the big screen, and it's going to be on general release, and it's about 2 hours showing the world, and there's no sound, only music. No one's giving you an opinion on what's going on, and some things are pretty worrying, and some of the food production that we now have is really quite worrying. But it is also an amazing film, shot a lot from the air, that shows that the world is just amazing. So if this was a pulpit and not what it is, and if I was ordained, I'd be telling people, you know, isn't the world great and the environment is worth protecting?
One of the things which I'm very keen we should do is quantify what we're doing. And the things like, I haven't heard Bruce thing on the community energy project, but things in the church, are you quantifying it in a way which articulates the synergistic benefit? So there's a financial quantification, a health quantification, and a social benefit quantification. Because it's lovely to hear that the church has got its carbon reduction program, but it would be even more powerful if you were able to say, put up on a website somewhere, in 2007, the church's carbon reduction program saved X times the money, produced Y reduction in carbon dioxide, and incidentally, the number of people engaged in doing this were whatever, there's some social. And so, because the Treasury and all of these other intransigent people are in part intransigent because they don't believe what many of us say will be the outcomes of the policies we put into place. And unless we can quantify them in a synergistic way, I think we're losing a trick. And one of the things I would ask the church to do, and everyone else actually who's doing these things, is to put figures on what's going on and make them widely available so we can all use them as examples of what can happen in well-ordered and well-regulated places. So please, can you persuade whoever it is needs persuading to quantify it?
Well, when General Synod voted to reduce the Church of England's energy footprint, I sort of was just coming into this post, and so my question back was, well, what is the Church of England's energy use? And of course nobody knew. So the first thing we had to do was to launch measuring our footprint. And in those days, you had to measure things by putting a questionnaire in the post and sending it to a church treasurer and asking him to go back through the previous energy bills and working out what had been the energy use, the energy units for the previous year. That's why we have now launched this new scheme, which is electronic, which means that every church can actually put those figures. So we have an estimate of the energy use in 2006, which in sort of easy terms, if you take the church buildings, it's the equivalent of the John Lewis Partnership, including Waitrose. And if you add the membership of the church to that figure, you get an energy use equivalent of Sainsbury's. So that in easy terms is to say, well, we actually, the Church of England does have a lot of energy use, is using a lot of energy, and we've got a figure to reduce. And we have announced the figure that we want to reduce it by. Bearing in mind that, you know, no church is particularly well off. And so this actually makes sense to people who have to keep their churches going by saying, you know, what can we do to reduce the energy use and thereby the energy bills, if that's possible. I mean, the bills will still keep going up, even though we reduce the energy, I suspect. But it does make a lot of sense for the church to manage those figures, and certainly the more we can use this electronic system, then the more the figures we will have, and do it each year so that we can show them the effect that we're having.
And I imagine that a quarter of your roof structures on churches should be facing south.
Yes.
So they're classics for
Yes, they are.
solar panels.
Feed-in tariffs make a difference
Yes.
too.
I'd love to see a scheme whereby the church aims to put solar panels on every church roof in the country. It would galvanise the debate on climate change. It would put the church at the forefront of the debate, and it would stop the newspapers talking about women bishops and gay priests.
Well, we're all for that. There are things like planning rules and heritage bodies that tend to stop you.
We
just putting the solar panels.
Even stop.
Well, we must.
They have to get into the 21st century.
Well, one of the problems is that there was a church in Hampstead, and the Bishop of London was very keen because its roof could not be seen, so we were fairly safe on planning. But the cost that it would have meant the church finding, when we spoke to the people who were running the church, and they made a list of all the things they could do if they had that sort of money. So the cost.
The local community will fund it.
Well,
you can put your energy back into the grid and pay for it that way.
Well, that would be great. The other thing about community energy and the grid, it would be great if the local community could actually use the energy that we produce and that it didn't go into the grid. People, I think, would be much more encouraged if they felt they had a community energy scheme, and then they could say maybe the poorer members of the community could have their energy for free, and those who can afford it, and getting together in a club and saying our community really makes its own energy, which would also make it much less reliant on the big 6 companies and our friends in Russia.
The question I thought Mike was going to ask you is something I alluded to earlier. I was talking about Galileo and the fact that he went before the Inquisition in 1633 because saying that the Earth went round the Sun, and it took the Catholic Church 359 years to admit that Galileo was right. So how long do you think before the Catholic Church would admit that contraception is a good idea?
You'd have to ask a Catholic.
I asked lots, they wouldn't come. But this is outrageous. I mean, the Pope said, I got a green Pope bill now. Well, so what, frankly? And there's 500 million Catholics in the world. Now, women make up their own minds in Western countries, but there's lots of countries where they don't, where they slavishly follow the teachings of the Catholic Church, which are incompatible with a low-carbon economy.
Well, I'll give you the telephone number of the lady who advises the Catholic Bishops' Conference, and you could invite her